A console can survive weak graphics. It can survive an ugly controller. It can even survive a terrible launch. But the moment players stop trusting the company behind it, the hardware is already dead. 4 consoles learned that lesson so violently that they did more than lose money. They confused customers, abandoned developers, damaged legendary brands, and, in one case, appeared just as the entire American gaming industry was collapsing. But the most frightening part is that none of these machines failed because their creators lacked experience. They failed because successful companies became convinced they could ignore one simple promise. We will come back to that promise because it connects every disaster on this list, and the final machine broke it so completely that only around 42,000 people bought one. The first failure began with a vision that sounded almost impossible to resist. In 1993, the 3DO interactive multiplayer arrived from Trip Hawkins, the founder of Electronic Arts. Instead of one company controlling the hardware, manufacturers such as Panasonic, Gold Star, and Sanyo would license a common 3DO standard. Game publishers would pay only about $3 in royalties per disc, far less than the fees associated with Nintendo or Sega. Lower fees should have attracted developers, while multiple hardware companies should have expanded the market. But the business model contained a trap. Traditional console companies could sell hardware at a loss because they earned money from every game sold. Panasonic could not depend on those royalties, so its first 3DO machine had to be profitable by itself. That pushed the launch price to $699, equivalent to well over $1,200 today, while a Genesis or Super Nintendo cost a fraction of that amount. For $700, customers expected the future. What they received was one launch game, crash and burn, delayed software, and a machine marketed as a mysterious multimedia appliance. It could play games, music CDs, photo CDs, and video discs, but consumers could not tell which feature justified the price. Even stranger, the original controller offered only one main controller port, so additional controllers had to be connected through one another like an expensive electronic chain. To be fair, the 3DO was powerful for 1993. Need for Speed began there. Road Rash delivered fast, textured 3D roads and an unforgettable soundtrack. Super Street Fighter II Turbo received a strong conversion. But good technology has an expiration date, and Sony was about to stamp one onto the box. The PlayStation reached North America in September 1995 for $299. It was more focused, easier to understand, heavily supported by third-party studios, and hundreds of dollars cheaper than the original Panasonic 3DO. So the supposedly universal multimedia future suddenly looked like an overpriced experiment from the recent past. Around 2 million 3DO machines were sold before production ended in 1996. That sounds respectable until you compare it with the PlayStation's 102 million units. The 3DO did not fail because the games were universally bad. It failed because a revolutionary licensing idea created a console price ordinary players could not justify. But 2 million sales still meant that a meaningful audience had taken the risk. The next machine sold roughly half as many, despite following one of the most successful consoles ever made, and its failure became tangled with the collapse of an entire market. Atari's 2600 sold roughly 30 million units and turned interchangeable game cartridges into a mass-market phenomenon. So its successor should have been an easy victory. Released in 1982, the Atari 5200 offered improved graphics, more memory, 4 controller ports, and a futuristic automatic television switch box. But pick up the controller, and the illusion collapsed. The 5200 used a non-centering analog joystick. Move it left, release it, and the stick stayed left instead of snapping back to the middle. That could offer precise analog control in theory, but most games were designed around quick digital movement. So Pac-Man, a game about instant turns inside tight corridors, could feel like steering a shopping cart with a broken wheel. Controllers were also notoriously unreliable, with buttons and internal contacts that frequently stopped responding. Atari had another problem. The original 5200 could not play the enormous library of 2600 cartridges. So loyal owners were asked to replace their console, replace their controllers, and rebuild their game collection. Yet the included title was Super Breakout, a version of a game already associated with the older system. Many other releases were upgraded interpretations of familiar arcade titles rather than experiences that made the new hardware essential. That created a devastating question. If the games looked familiar, but the controller felt worse, why upgrade? Atari later released an adapter for 2600 games and redesigned the console, but trust was draining from the entire market. Stores were overloaded with low-quality cartridges, publishers were producing more games than consumers wanted, and retailers were losing confidence in video games as a category. The 5200 did not single-handedly cause the North American video game crash of 1983, but it became a symbol of the thinking that fed it. More hardware, more products, more promises, but not enough attention to the person holding the controller. Sales barely passed 1 million units. In May 1984, Atari announced the newer 7800, so the 5200 was discontinued after less than 2 years. The successor to one of history's most important consoles had become disposable almost overnight. Atari proved that a famous name could not force players to upgrade. But more than a decade later, Sega made an even more personal mistake. It convinced loyal customers to buy into a new future, only to announce that future's replacement almost immediately. In 1994, Sega looked powerful. Genesis had transformed Sonic the Hedgehog into a global icon, challenged Nintendo's dominance, and briefly captured more than half of the American 16-bit console market. But behind the aggressive advertising, Sega was under pressure. Newer machines such as the Atari Jaguar and 3DO were promising 32-bit graphics, while Sega's true next-generation console, the Saturn, was still being prepared for release. So Sega created a bridge called the 32X. The idea sounded reasonable. Pay $159, plug the mushroom-shaped device into the top of a Genesis, and upgrade the old 16-bit console with 32-bit hardware capable of displaying more than 32,000 colors. It was cheaper than buying a completely new system. It could still use Genesis cartridges, and games such as Virtua Racing Deluxe and Doom showed real potential. But a bridge is useless when everyone knows it leads to a building scheduled for demolition. The 32X reached American stores in November 1994, but the Saturn was already coming. That placed buyers in an absurd position. Should they upgrade the Genesis now, or save their money for Sega's actual next-generation console? More importantly, why would developers spend months making 32X games when the hardware could become irrelevant within a year? Sega promised roughly a dozen launch titles, but only 6 were available in North America on day one. Development kits arrived late, projects were rushed, and the library never recovered. Approximately 40 games were released worldwide, with quality ranging from impressive to painfully unfinished. Even connecting the device was awkward, requiring extra cables, another power supply, and metal shielding plates. The sleek Genesis had become a plastic tower with wires spilling behind the television. But Sega made the damage worse by launching the Saturn early in the United States in May 1995. Retailers were surprised, developers were unprepared, and 32X owners received the message clearly. The upgrade Sega had sold them months earlier was already yesterday's news. Prices collapsed. Some stores eventually cleared the hardware for around $20, and estimated sales stalled near 665,000 units. That was far below the Atari 5200 and only 1/15 of the Genesis sales Sega had built its confidence on. Sega had not simply released an unsuccessful accessory. It had asked its most loyal customers to invest in a future Sega itself abandoned almost immediately. But even 665,000 buyers created a visible community of owners and developers. The final machine never got that far. It carried one of the most respected names in consumer technology, entered the market with powerful partners, and sold fewer units than some individual PlayStation games sold in a single week. In 1996, Apple was not the multi-trillion-dollar giant people recognize today. The company was struggling, its product lineup was confusing, and Steve Jobs had not yet returned as chief executive. But Apple still saw an opportunity in the living room, so it licensed a multimedia platform called Pippen to Bandai. On paper, the Bandai Pippin had attractive features. It used technology derived from the Macintosh, included a 66 MHz PowerPC processor, supported CD-ROM software, and could connect to the internet through a built-in modem. Bandai's American model even had a wonderfully optimistic name, the Pippin at World. But what exactly was it? At $599, it was too expensive to feel like a normal game console. As a computer, it lacked the flexibility and software library of a proper Macintosh or Windows PC. As an internet device, it arrived when dial-up connections were slow, online content was primitive, and most families were still asking why they needed the internet in the first place. Apple described Pippin as a platform for education, entertainment, and information. That sounds modern now, but in 1996 it sounded like 3 unfinished products trapped in one beige box. The controller revealed the identity crisis perfectly. It looked like a gamepad, but a trackball sat in the middle so users could navigate computer-style menus from across the room. That was clever, but clever hardware cannot compensate for missing software. Major publishers stayed away. Bandai carried most of the burden, and only about 25 titles appeared for the platform. The timing was brutal. The PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and Nintendo 64 were competing with recognizable characters, major arcade conversions, and expanding libraries. Pippen was trying to explain why browsing basic web pages on a television was worth twice the price of a PlayStation. So here is the number that turns a failed launch into near-total market rejection. Only around 42,000 units were sold. That was less than 1/16 of the 32X, about 1/24 of the Atari 5200, and barely 2,000th of the PlayStation's eventual total. Bandai reportedly manufactured far more, so warehouses held tens of thousands of unwanted machines. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple, he ended the company's clone licensing strategy, and Pippen disappeared with it. That finally reveals the promise all four machines broke. When someone buys a console, they are not really buying plastic, processors, or launch games. They are buying confidence that the machine will still matter tomorrow. 3DO priced that confidence beyond reach. Atari expected loyalty without earning it. Sega destroyed it with competing hardware. Apple never explained what buyers were supposed to believe in. These machines did not fail simply because they were weak. They failed because each empty controller port, clearance sticker, and abandoned game library reminded players that even the biggest names could take their money and leave them holding an expensive box with nowhere to go. Perhaps the real difference between a beloved console and a forgotten one is not power, but whether opening the box feels like the beginning of something instead of the end. Which of these four failures would you have been most disappointed to own? Share your choice below, and subscribe if you want more stories about the strange decisions that shaped gaming history.